This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, something procedural, something that used to happen automatically and now doesn't. For decades, the system worked on a basic assumption that the rules mattered more than loyalty, that funding followed law, that permission followed process, that disagreement did not trigger punishment. That assumption is no longer safe. What's happening now doesn't announce itself. It arrives through delays, through freezes, through sudden reversals that feel technical, temporary, deniable, until they aren't, until patterns form, until the exception becomes the method. If this sounds abstract, stay with me, because abstraction is how systemic failure hides. And because if you're only watching for explosions, you miss the slow removal of load-bearing beams. This story isn't loud, but it's moving fast. And once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee where it leads. So keep watching, because the next step explains who actually controls the system now and why that should unsettle you. What actually controls the system right now is not ideology. It's leverage, not votes, not public opinion. Leverage embedded in process. The modern state doesn't move through speeches. It moves through approvals, through disbursements, through permits, through timing, through the quiet discretion of whether something proceeds, stalls, or disappears into review. Power now lives in those margins. When that discretion is treated as neutral, the system feels boring, predictable, safe. When it's treated as conditional, everything changes, because the question stops being, is this legal, and becomes, who deserves it? That shift doesn't require new laws. It doesn't require formal declarations. It only requires the executive to reinterpret compliance as loyalty, to treat cooperation as a prerequisite rather than a result, to reward alignment not with praise, but with continuity. And here's the destabilizing part. Most of this still looks like governance. Forms are filed, orders are signed, language remains technical. On paper, nothing is broken. But when access replaces rules, the system stops being a system. It becomes a series of gates. And once power lives at the gate, the next change happens quietly and much more slowly. There was a time when this kind of power moved differently. Before, the system assumed continuity. If something was approved, it stayed approved. If funds were allocated, they flowed. If rules were followed, outcomes followed. Politics happened around the system, not inside its plumbing. Now, compare that to what's normal today. Approvals become provisional. Funding becomes reversible. Projects exist in a state of permanent suspension, not because the law changed, but because discretion did. What used to be automatic is now contingent. What used to be boring is now strategic. That shift didn't arrive with a headline. It arrived through normalization. One delay, one pause, one exception explained as temporary, then another, slow enough to ignore, technical enough to excuse. This is the most dangerous kind of change. Not abrupt, not dramatic, but cumulative. Because systems don't fail when rules are broken loudly. They fail when the rules still exist, but no longer bind. When everyone adjusts behavior quietly to avoid friction. When compliance becomes adaptive instead of procedural, by the time people notice, they're already navigating a different landscape. And the first real shock doesn't come from the change itself. It comes when someone finally tests the boundary and the system reacts. Then here's where the abstraction breaks. Because eventually, the quiet shift produces a visible shock. A line gets crossed, and the system flinches. In this case, it wasn't rhetoric, it wasn't a speech, it was money. Billions of dollars already allocated by law, already approved, already spoken for, suddenly targeted. Not because the projects failed, not because the criteria changed, but because of where they were located and who lived there. Energy funding, infrastructure, clean power projects, treated not as national policy, but as a reward structure. Leave it in places that complied, pull it from places that didn't, not quietly, explicitly. At the same time, a major offshore wind project, fully permitted, already underway, was ordered to stop. Not for safety, not for legality, but through regulatory intervention that arrived after the fact. This wasn't governance by accident. It was intent made visible. And when the cases reached court, judges didn't debate policy. They blocked the actions outright. Illegal, not ambiguous, not close. If you're wondering why this matters, don't look at the project. Look at the precedent it tried to establish. Because once punishment becomes explicit, the next move isn't subtle. It's structural. Here's the mechanism that makes all of this possible. The system doesn't break by ignoring the law. It breaks by overloading enforcement. Every modern government runs on delegation. Congress writes broad rules, agencies interpret them, discretion fills the gaps. That discretion is supposed to be bounded by precedent, by process, by internal review. But when pressure is applied from the top, discretion becomes directional. Nothing has to be formally changed. No statute repealed, no rule erased. Funds are paused, reviews are reopened, permits are reconsidered, grants are rescinded pending evaluation, each move defensible in isolation. Together they form a pattern. Who benefits is not mysterious. Jurisdictions that align face continuity, stability, predictability. Everyone else absorbs the friction. Delays cost money. Uncertainty kills investment. Organizations self-censor. States adjust behavior preemptively to avoid punishment. And here's the crucial point. The damage is asymmetrical. The executive risks nothing by trying. If blocked, the court restores the status quo. But the delay already did its work. Project stalled. Signals sent. Fear introduced. That's the hidden efficiency of this model. Even failure advances the goal. Because the real product isn't compliance. It's deterrence. And once deterrence is normalized, the next shock doesn't need to be as large. It just needs to be faster. This is where the tempo changes. Because once the mechanism is in motion, it doesn't stay contained. Grants vanish, then reappear, then vanish again. Professional organizations criticize policy and suddenly lose funding, not through legislation, through cancellation notices, health programs, child services, support systems that don't have political insulation. The pace accelerates. Election funding becomes conditional. States are told implicitly that money depends on compliance with preferences that don't exist in law. Refuse, and the support evaporates. This isn't reform. It's coercion with a receipt. Courts step in. Again, orders issued, funding restored, actions blocked. The language shifts. No longer cautious, no longer deferential. Judges stop asking whether the executive made a mistake and start stating that the law is being broken repeatedly, and that's the tell. Because when courts abandon patience, it means they're seeing volume, pattern, intent. This isn't one overreach, it's serial. And every intervention raises the stakes, not for the executive, but for the system tasked with catching it. Each ruling restores legality, but at the cost of speed, trust, and institutional energy. The guardrails are still there, but they're being hit over and over. And systems don't collapse the first time they're stressed. They collapse when stress becomes routine. At this point, this isn't abstract anymore, because the friction lands somewhere. It lands on you. If you live in a place that isn't aligned, things start to feel unreliable. Programs you assumed existed suddenly require explanations. Services pause without warning. Costs rise not because the market changed, but because uncertainty was injected upstream. If you work in healthcare, science, education, infrastructure, you learn to read signals, not laws, signals. You hesitate before speaking, before planning, before expanding, because you've seen what happens when funding becomes conditional on silence. Even if a court eventually fixes it, The damage is already priced in. Lost time, lost momentum, lost trust. And that's the part most people never see. The system still looks intact. Checks still fire, rulings still land, but daily life becomes narrower, riskier, more careful. This is how people adapt without being told to. This is how behavior changes without force. And if you're thinking, this will get corrected, remember, correction now depends on emergency response, on judges, on defections, on timing. That's not stability. That's triage. If this feels unsettling, don't disengage. Pay attention, share this, stay with the process, because the next phase isn't about one country. It's about what happens when this model travels. Once this model exists, it doesn't stay domestic, because capital watches, allies watch, markets watch patterns more than statements. When a government demonstrates that approvals, funding, and regulatory stability depend on political alignment, the signal travels faster than the rulings that try to correct it. Investors don't wait for court outcomes. They price in risk immediately. Infrastructure projects slow. Research partnerships hesitate. Long-term commitments shrink. And internationally, the message is even sharper. If internal rules can be bent transactionally, external commitments look provisional too. Trade agreements feel softer. Security assurances feel conditional. The difference between policy and preference blurs. Other governments notice something else as well, how much pressure the system can absorb before it pushes back. They watch courts intervene, they watch legislatures fracture, and they measure the lag, not to admire it, but to learn from it. Because once instability is normalized inside a major system, it becomes exportable, not as ideology, as technique. This is how trust erodes without a formal breach. No announcement, no withdrawal, just enough unpredictability to make everyone cautious. And here's the unresolved question hanging over all of it. If the system holds only because it's constantly correcting itself, what happens when correction can't keep up? That question doesn't have a local answer. From here, the system has three possible paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The institutions learn. Courts harden faster. Legislatures preempt more aggressively. Discretion narrows. The system adapts by tightening itself. This preserves function, but at a cost. Everything slows. Governance becomes defensive. Stability survives, but flexibility doesn't. The second path is erosion, not collapse, drift. The guardrails still exist, but enforcement becomes selective. Fatigue sets in. Not every overreach is challenged. Not every pause is litigated. Small exceptions accumulate. The system still claims legitimacy, but fewer people believe it operates neutrally. Compliance becomes strategic. Trust thins. The third path is rupture. This is not sudden chaos. It's a moment when an overreach finally isn't blocked in time. A court delays. A vote fails. A margin slips. One action sticks. And because precedent matters, the next one is easier. The system doesn't shatter. It reconfigures. Which path unfolds depends on timing, on margins, on attention, on whether corrective institutions stay ahead of the pressure or start reacting just a little too late. Nothing here is inevitable. But none of it is theoretical anymore. And the most important part is this. The decision point isn't in the future. It's already in motion. So here we are, not at an ending, at an exposure, because the danger in this story was never one action or one branch or one moment that could be reversed and filed away. The danger is a system learning that it can be bent repeatedly without breaking and mistaking that for safety. What you've been watching is not failure. It's stress tolerance being tested in real time. Every blocked order, every restored grant, every emergency ruling, those aren't signs of health. They're warning lights telling you how much force is being applied behind the scenes. And the system hasn't decided yet whether this is a lesson it absorbs or a behavior it normalizes. That decision won't arrive with an announcement. It will show up quietly in what gets challenged next, in what doesn't, in how fast institutions respond, in whether attention holds long enough to matter, So don't look away expecting resolution. There isn't one yet. What comes next depends on whether people keep watching the process, not just the outcome. Whether pressure stays visible. Whether this pattern is understood before it's absorbed. Stay with this. Share it, because the next phase won't explain itself. And if you miss it, you won't notice the system has changed until it no longer works the way you remember.